When we think of periods today, we often think of tampons, pads, and convenience. It's an everyday part of life that we hardly give a second thought. But what if I told you that before these modern inventions, menstruation was a time of secrecy, suffering, and unimaginable hardship? Before the quiet ease of today's sanitary products, women in the medieval era endured a brutal, isolated existence when their bodies bled. This was a time when menstruation wasn't merely a biological function, it was a curse that condemned women to lives of fear and silence, haunted by superstition, societal rejection, and harsh medical practices. Imagine the terror of bleeding into rags that could never be washed clean. Picture being confined to a dark, cold hut, away from the eyes of the community, as though you were contagious. The scent of menstruation lingered in the air, a stark reminder that you were unclean, an outcast, shunned from society. While you bled, whispers surrounded you. Rumors that your blood was more than just blood. It was thought to be dangerous, capable of poisoning the earth, spoiling crops, even souring wine. To live through menstruation in medieval times was to be marked by something beyond the natural. It was to live with fear of being branded a witch, fear of being punished, and fear of dying because no one understood the dangers that came with it. In those days, medical treatment wasn't a path to healing. It was a torment. Purging, bloodletting, and strange remedies were forced upon women, all in the name of purifying their bodies. These cures only worsened their suffering, and many women didn't survive them. Now, ask yourself, how much do you really know about what women in medieval times went through? The chilling reality is waiting to be uncovered. If you want to dive deeper into this history, don't hesitate. Subscribe now, or you'll remain in the dark, just as these women were, lost to time and forgotten by all. Medieval society viewed menstruation not as a natural biological process, but as a curse, an act that tainted the very essence of a woman's being. To the eyes of the time, a menstruating woman was an object of fear, suspicion, and disgust. The very blood that flowed from her body was thought to hold a power far darker than its mere physical presence. It was believed to possess a malevolent force, capable of ruining the harvest, poisoning the earth, and even corrupting the purity of water. This blood, so essential to life, was simultaneously feared for the death it might bring. Menstrual blood was thought to spoil crops, sour wine, and weaken livestock. The earth itself was thought to recoil at its touch, and any unfortunate creature that came too close would feel its effects. A woman's period was more than just a sign of fertility. It was an ominous warning to those around her, a sign that something unnatural had occurred. The fear surrounding menstruation was not confined to rural superstitions. It spread to the highest echelons of society, where it was embraced, enforced, and even institutionalized. The church, which held immense power over daily life, viewed menstruating women as unclean, an impurity to be hidden away, feared, and controlled. The concept of ritual purity was deeply ingrained in Christian teachings, and menstruation was seen as a violation of this sacred cleanliness. Women who bled were often ostracized, exiled from the community to prevent their impurity from contaminating others. In some Christian traditions, a menstruating woman was forbidden from attending Mass or even entering the church. The holiest of places, the house of God, was off-limits to her. The church's condemnation wasn't just spiritual, it became social. A woman's worth, her connection to the divine, was measured by her purity. And during her period, she was anything but pure. This isolation was not a mere suggestion, it was law. Women were sent away to live in seclusion, often in huts, far from the towns and villages where they lived their lives. The menstrual hut became a tragic reality, a place where women were not only physically isolated but mentally and emotionally abandoned. In the eyes of society, the woman who menstruated was no longer fully human. She was a walking vessel of contamination, someone to be avoided at all costs. She could no longer fulfill her duties as a wife, mother, or member of the community. She was marked by blood, and the mark was a symbol of deep shame. As the blood flowed, so did the silence. Silence not just in the form of isolation, but also in the language surrounding menstruation. The words used were laced with fear, and the very mention of it could bring shame. To speak openly of one's menstrual cycle was to invite ridicule, judgment, and punishment. It was a subject no one dared touch, as though the very air was poisoned by it. The more people tried to avoid it, the more it seeped into their nightmares, into their daily lives. The church's teachings were not just theological, they were psychological. Fear of menstruation permeated every layer of society. Women were made to feel as though they were cursed, unnatural, less than human during their periods. The blood that nourished life was viewed as something destructive, something capable of polluting the sacred, polluting the world. And yet, in the midst of this widespread fear and misunderstanding, the women themselves had no choice but to endure. They bled in silence, in isolation, enduring both physical and psychological torment. The blood they shed was not merely a biological function. It was a marker of their separation from the divine, from their community, from their own humanity. If you think this was simply an ancient belief that died with the passing centuries, think again. The stigmas and fears that shaped medieval menstruation still echo in our world today. The medieval views, once so powerful, planted the seeds of modern-day taboos. What was once a cruel mark of impurity is still, in many parts of the world, a mark of shame. Now, pause and think. How far have we really come from those dark days of medieval superstition? How much of that fear still clings to our society today? How many still carry the burden of silence, of being unclean, simply because of their biology? Ask yourself, how much has changed, really? One of the most disturbing practices of the medieval era was the concept of the menstrual hut. When a woman's blood began to flow, society's view of her changed drastically. She was no longer a member of the community. She was a walking contamination. Menstruation, in the eyes of medieval people, was a dangerous event, something that could not only corrupt a woman's purity, but also pose a threat to the purity of others around her. And so, in the harsh, unforgiving world of medieval Europe, she was exiled, cast away from her family, her friends, and the sacred space of her home. For the duration of her period, she was sent to live in a place of isolation, a hut, a shed, a small structure built far from the village or town, where she could not infect others. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a rule, a harsh, dehumanizing rule. Inside these huts, the conditions were grim. The women who were forced to dwell there found themselves vulnerable to the elements, cold winds, driving rain, and the unbearable chill of isolation. No warmth, no comfort, only the harsh, unforgiving embrace of nature. The huts were often poorly constructed, with no protection from the cold and no means to keep the rain out. And as if this cruel isolation wasn't enough, these women faced hunger. Their isolation meant that they were often unable to gather food or even receive a proper meal. It was a cruel and relentless cycle, bleeding, freezing, and starving, all while being completely cut off from the world. They were not allowed to cook, to speak with anyone, or even to bathe in the warmth of human connection. The isolation was not just physical, it was deeply emotional and psychological. Deprived of the social fabric that kept them grounded, these women were left to brood in solitude. For those who had families, the separation was nothing short of devastating. They could not tend to their children. They could not serve their husbands. They could not participate in the simple joys of daily life. For many, their time in the menstrual hut was filled with a crushing sense of loneliness, a deep isolation that felt like a punishment, even though it was a practice rooted in superstition. And as they sat in these huts, their minds turned inward. What had they done to deserve such cruel treatment? Was their body really something to be feared, to be hidden away? These were the questions that echoed in their minds as they endured days, sometimes weeks, of isolation. But the physical hardships didn't end there. The huts were breeding grounds for disease. Without proper sanitation, without protection from the elements, the women who found themselves confined to these spaces were incredibly vulnerable to infection. Fungal infections, skin diseases, and other illnesses that arose from poor hygiene were common. In some cases, the huts were so poorly constructed that they became death traps. Women who found themselves in these shelters could easily succumb to sickness, alone, without help, without the comfort of knowing someone cared. Their lives, reduced to the most basic human needs, shelter, food, and warmth, were placed in jeopardy by a practice rooted in fear and misunderstanding. And yet, despite the horrors of this isolation, there was no escape. No voice to speak for these women. No one to stand against the oppression they endured. They were forced to accept this fate, for to question it was to invite further scorn. In the eyes of society, menstruation was an unavoidable shame. It was a curse not just on the woman, but on the entire community. If they allowed it to remain unchecked, if they allowed the purity of the woman to remain tainted, they feared that the very fabric of their world would begin to unravel. So, they isolated her, they shunned her, and they made her pay for a condition that was as natural as the seasons. But the suffering didn't stop with the physical hardships. There was another cruelty at play, one that was far darker. The women were not just confined to these huts, they were punished for their very existence. The punishment for menstruating was not only the harsh conditions of the huts, but the constant reminder that their bodies were something to be feared, something to be controlled. Their very nature, a symbol of life and death, of growth and decay, was regarded as a danger. They were dangerous, not for what they had done, but for what they were, biologically. And this reality lingered in the air as they sat in their cold huts, staring into the void, trying to make sense of the cruelty that had been forced upon them. The isolation was, in its own twisted way, a form of control. Society had determined that a woman's body was not her own. It was something that could be dominated, manipulated, and separated from the rest of humanity. And in the silence of those huts, in the bitter cold and gnawing hunger, these women began to understand this truth. They were never truly free. The control over their bodies would never end. And every month, as they bled, the cycle of suffering would begin anew. How many women endured this in silence? How many were broken by this oppressive system, forced to suffer in solitude and despair? The answers are lost to history, buried beneath the weight of time and the shame that society forced upon them. But their story, their pain, and their silence remain etched in the past. And perhaps it's time we remember them. Before the modern comforts of tampons and pads, women of the medieval era were left with nothing but makeshift solutions to manage their menstruation. The options they had were crude and often unsanitary, nothing more than temporary fixes for a deeply uncomfortable and unhygienic situation. Rags, scraps of cloth, torn from old garments, or even linens were the most common solution. These rags, often washed in cold water or not washed at all, were pressed into service as absorbent materials. But these were hardly the only options. In rural communities, women were forced to resort to anything they could find: sea sponges, animal fur, and even moss. Moss, the very same plant that grows in damp and cold environments, was pressed into service as an improvised pad. Imagine the discomfort, the dampness, the itch, the suffocating heat. The materials they used, though creative in their resourcefulness, were not designed for such intimate purposes. These solutions were not absorbent enough, and they often left women vulnerable to dangerous infections. A woman could only imagine the horror of trying to manage her period with such makeshift materials, praying that the rags would hold up through the day. But the shame that came with menstruation in medieval times wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was the guilt of hiding, of being made to feel unclean, of knowing that your body was a constant reminder of something forbidden, something to be hidden away. These rudimentary methods were not just uncomfortable, they were hazardous. Without the convenience of modern hygiene, the risk of infection loomed large. The rags and sponges, if not properly cleaned or sanitized, would trap bacteria. These infections would spread quickly, making life even more unbearable for the women who had no other choice but to endure. The very materials that were meant to offer some semblance of protection were, in fact, breeding grounds for disease. Many women developed painful infections, rashes, and sores from prolonged use of unsanitary materials. Without the knowledge or the means to properly care for themselves, the consequences were often devastating. It wasn't just discomfort and shame that these women had to endure. The lack of proper hygiene also led to a host of serious health risks. Toxic shock syndrome, an illness that would later be associated with the use of modern tampons, was a silent killer in the medieval world. Women could, and often did, develop sepsis, infections, and other life-threatening complications from their menstrual blood not being properly managed. With no proper sanitary products, no effective way to clean, and no understanding of how menstruation could be hygienically handled, these women were left vulnerable to diseases that we can only imagine today. The lack of medical knowledge meant that what we now see as minor issues were often life or death matters. The emotional burden of this suffering was also immense. A woman's period was not just an inconvenience. It was a source of constant pain, both physical and emotional. The shame surrounding menstruation meant that women could not speak openly about their suffering. The secrecy of menstruation left them isolated, cut off not just from their community, but from any potential support. To admit pain or discomfort was to risk being further shunned, to risk admitting that their bodies were not clean. The fear of infection, combined with the physical discomfort of unsanitary materials, meant that women had no safe space to grieve their condition, no space to complain, no space to ask for help. Their pain went unnoticed, unspoken, as they bled in silence. Imagine the weight of that silence, the endless days of suffering without an outlet, knowing that the very act of menstruation was something to be ashamed of, something to hide from the world. These women had to endure not only the biological process of menstruation, but also the constant psychological pressure of being viewed as impure, unclean, and unnatural. The trauma of dealing with these harsh conditions was not just physical. It was woven into the very fabric of their daily lives, a constant reminder of their place in a world that saw them as lesser, as objects of shame. In the midst of all this suffering, there was no support system. The community saw menstruation as something to be hidden, not something to be discussed, let alone alleviated. The women who faced these hardships had no recourse, no way of escaping the grip of the taboo that surrounded them. They were isolated not just by physical means, but by the walls of fear and ignorance that surrounded their bodies. The rags, the moss, the sponges, these were not just crude attempts at hygiene. They were symbols of a woman's struggle to reclaim some semblance of control over her own body in a world that refused to acknowledge her humanity. In a time when medicine was rudimentary and the body was a mystery, women had to survive, not thrive. And those who didn't survive the infections, the complications, or the psychological toll of menstruation in such harsh conditions were the forgotten ones, left behind in the shadow of history, their stories untold, their suffering buried under centuries of silence. Imagine a world where the simplest things, cleanliness, comfort, compassion, were beyond reach. This was the reality for countless women throughout the medieval period, their lives marked by both a natural process and the cruelty of a society that treated them as lesser beings for something they could not control. And in the darkness of that history, their pain remains, unspoken, lingering in the echoes of time. Medieval medicine, much like the rest of society at the time, was steeped in superstition and ignorance. The world of healing was primitive, driven by bizarre and often grotesque beliefs that had little to do with science and everything to do with mysticism. One of the darkest and most disturbing practices was the belief that menstrual blood had medicinal properties. Yes, you heard that right. Menstrual blood, the very same substance that society had deemed impure and dangerous, was thought to be a cure for certain ailments. This was not a mere folk remedy. This belief was widely accepted among medieval doctors and healers who believed that menstrual blood held mystical powers, capable of curing diseases, soothing pain, and even providing protection against harmful forces. Some doctors in medieval Europe believed that menstrual blood was an essential ingredient in various potions and salves. It was thought to possess curative qualities that could heal wounds, treat ulcers, and restore balance to the body. Menstrual blood was used in concoctions designed to treat everything from headaches to infertility, and even to ward off evil spirits. The very blood that women bled in shame was now a sought-after substance in the healing practices of the time. For many women, this was a cruel irony. Their very bodies, once regarded as dangerous and tainted, were now being used as a source of medicine. But this didn't make their lives any less painful. It only added another layer of exploitation and dehumanization. These women were not only forced to endure the biological consequences of their periods, but were also seen as mere vessels, their blood harvested for the supposed healing of others. Yet, the use of menstrual blood in medieval medicine was not the only grotesque practice women were subjected to. There was the dangerous and equally nonsensical belief in the healing power of bloodletting. Bloodletting was widely practiced during the medieval period, a method thought to restore balance to the body by removing excess blood. And for menstruating women, this practice took on a new, terrifying dimension. Women who were already suffering from the physical toll of menstruation were often subjected to bloodletting during their periods as part of the treatment to balance their humors. The idea was that by removing blood from the body, it would restore the balance between the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, believed to govern health. But instead of offering relief, bloodletting often worsened the condition of the women involved. These women, already weakened from blood loss due to menstruation, were left even more vulnerable to infections, diseases, and sometimes death. The practice was not based on any understanding of human anatomy or biology, but on the prevailing medical theory of the time, which was rooted in ancient Greek and Roman ideas that had long since been discredited. Yet, for centuries, it continued to be a go-to method of treatment for a range of ailments, including menstruation. The dark truth of medieval medical beliefs is that they weren't just ineffective, they were actively harmful. Women were subjected to practices that not only failed to address their needs, but actively put their lives in jeopardy. The cruel irony of this era is that women's suffering was not viewed as something to be alleviated, but as something to be controlled, manipulated, and even used for the benefit of others. Their pain, their blood, and their bodies were commodities, resources to be exploited by a medical system that saw them as little more than vessels for disease or healing. Imagine the mental toll this must have had. A woman's body, already a source of shame and fear, was now a tool for others to use, but only in the most degrading and painful ways. The medical community, instead of offering compassion or healing, treated them as expendable. And it wasn't just the suffering that took its toll. It was the realization that a woman's body was never truly her own. She was a vessel of blood, her own blood, which was viewed both as something to be feared and something to be extracted for others' benefit. The connection to the medieval mindset is clear. Women's bodies were not sacred. They were sites of conflict, suffering, and exploitation. The very act of menstruation, which was meant to be a natural and empowering part of a woman's biological function, was twisted into something dark and horrific. This gruesome practice of bloodletting wasn't just confined to menstruation. It was part of a broader medical system that sought to control, rather than understand, the human body. And for women, this control was even more pronounced. Their periods were not a natural cycle, but a mysterious and dangerous affliction that could be used to explain away any number of health problems. If a woman was ill, it was often chalked up to the imbalance of her humors, which could be corrected through the loss of even more blood. Their bodies were seen as chaotic, untamed, in need of constant correction. For women who bled, this treatment was particularly cruel. They were already vulnerable, already weakened by their natural cycles, and yet they were forced to endure even more suffering at the hands of an ignorant medical system. How many women were subjected to these torturous practices, to these bizarre and brutal treatments, all in the name of healing? How many lives were lost, not because of menstruation itself, but because of the misguided and deadly treatments imposed upon them by those who claimed to know better? The tragic irony of this dark chapter in history is that it wasn't just the physical suffering that left women broken. It was the mental and emotional toll, the realization that they were nothing more than bodies to be feared, used, and discarded. As we look back on this history, we are forced to reckon with the legacy of the medieval medical system. We must ask ourselves how much we have truly progressed, and how many stories like those of these women have been lost to time. Their suffering was not just physical, it was psychological, cultural, and social. Their bodies were not just vessels of life, they were vessels of suffering. And in the shadows of that history, their pain remains, unspoken, waiting to be heard. Menstruation in medieval times was not just a biological process. It was a tool of control, an instrument wielded by the patriarchal society that sought to dominate every aspect of women's lives. The menstrual cycle, something as natural as breathing, was weaponized to enforce societal norms, to keep women in their place, and to maintain the strict hierarchies that governed every facet of life. Women's bodies were never truly their own. They were subject to the will of the men around them, be it their fathers, husbands, or the church. The very fact that women menstruated became a symbol of their inferiority, a visible marker of their difference, their impurity, and their inherent subjugation. The medieval view of menstruation was rooted deeply in the patriarchal belief that women were impure, unclean, and fundamentally flawed. This belief wasn't just passed down from generation to generation. It was codified into law and reinforced through religious teachings. The Church, with its unyielding authority, played a significant role in perpetuating the notion that menstruating women were not fit to participate in public life. During their periods, women were considered unclean, and as such, they were often excluded from religious services and social gatherings. A woman's period was not just a private affair. It was a visible signal to the world that she was temporarily disconnected from the divine, unworthy of the sacred spaces that men occupied without question. This exclusion went far beyond mere social ostracism. It was embedded in the very structure of medieval society. The restrictions on menstruating women were pervasive, extending into every corner of their lives. Women were not only excluded from religious rites, they were forced into isolation in their homes. They were kept from their duties as wives, mothers, and contributors to the community. Their presence, their very being, was considered a contamination, something to be hidden away, as if their bodies posed a threat to the purity of the world around them. But the punishment for breaking these taboos didn't end with exclusion. In fact, the consequences for menstruating women were often far more severe. To violate the rules surrounding menstruation was to risk public punishment, physical harm, and even death. Women who were caught ignoring the strict rules of menstrual segregation or who dared to challenge the prevailing religious decrees often found themselves subjected to horrific consequences. These women were accused of defiling the sacred, of acting against the natural order of things. Such women were not only labeled as sinners, they were branded as witches. They were accused of using their menstrual blood in black magic, in spells, and curses. This dark belief, combined with the growing witch hunts of the medieval period, led to the execution of countless women who were deemed impure or dangerous simply because they were menstruating. Imagine the horror of being a woman in this world, knowing that something as simple, as inevitable, as natural as menstruation could lead to your persecution, your public humiliation, or even your death. The very thing that marked you as female was also the thing that could be used to condemn you. The punishment for menstruation was not simply exclusion. It was degradation, dehumanization, and the destruction of your very identity. Menstruating women were not only punished for their bodies, they were punished for being women. Their bodies were never their own. Every aspect of their existence was governed by the whims of a male-dominated society that saw them as little more than vessels for reproduction, nothing more, nothing less. This punishment didn't just come from the state or the church. It came from the very communities women lived in. Neighbors, family members, and even friends could become the instruments of this social control. The societal rules were so deeply ingrained that even women themselves internalized the idea that menstruation was a curse, a mark of inferiority, a reason for shame. The cruelty of this system wasn't just in the punishment. It was in the way it stripped women of their agency, their self-worth, and their dignity. They were told, time and time again, that their very existence was tainted, that their bodies were something to be controlled, monitored, and corrected. This deeply ingrained belief in the impurity of menstruation was a cornerstone of patriarchal control. The suffering that women experienced during this time wasn't just physical. It was psychological, emotional, and social. The taboo surrounding menstruation became a tool used to keep women in check, to remind them of their place in the world. It wasn't just about blood. It was about power. The menstrual cycle was used as a constant reminder of the boundaries women had to remain within. It was a mechanism of control, a way to remind women that their bodies, their lives, and their voices were never truly their own. So ask yourself, how many women live their entire lives under this shadow, haunted by the knowledge that their bodies were not theirs to own, that their very existence was a subject of fear and shame? How many women, for centuries, were condemned, isolated, and silenced because of something as simple and natural as menstruation? The legacy of this cruelty has echoed through the ages, and it is a story that has remained largely untold. But it is a story we must hear, a story we must confront, for it is the forgotten truth of how women were controlled and manipulated by a world that feared their power, a world that sought to diminish them. Isn't it time you learned the full extent of this history? Subscribe to Dark Ancient Stories and witness the shadows of the past come alive. If you're still sitting on the fence, Drop a comment below about why you won't be part of a community that uncovers history's darkest truths. During the medieval period, menstruating women were not just marginalized, they were feared. The very act of menstruation, once seen as a natural and unavoidable biological function, became a symbol of something far darker, a supernatural force that could warp reality and invoke curses. This fear, rooted in superstition and ignorance, gave rise to the belief that menstrual blood possessed extraordinary powers that could control, harm, or manipulate the world around them. The blood of menstruating women was seen as both a threat and a tool. It was thought that it could summon evil spirits, curse the innocent, and bring about disasters. In the minds of the medieval people, menstruation was not just something physical. It was something magical, something dangerous. This belief in the mystical properties of menstrual blood created a direct and terrifying link between menstruating women and witchcraft. Women who bled were often suspected of using their blood for nefarious purposes: witchcraft, black magic, curses, or even the power to bring about death and destruction. Menstruating women were seen as vessels of dark, uncontrollable forces capable of performing sinister rituals and casting dangerous spells. The very blood that marked their womanhood became a weapon in the eyes of a fearful society, one that was desperate to explain the unknown through superstition and myth. The fear was pervasive. If something went wrong in the village, a bad harvest, an outbreak of disease, a misfortune, it was easier to blame a woman's menstruation than to seek logical explanations. In these times, women who bled were more than just women. They were witches. They were the embodiment of evil in a world that was already steeped in mystery and fear. The belief that menstrual blood was connected to witchcraft led to devastating consequences. As witch hunts began to sweep through Europe, women, especially those who were menstruating, became prime targets for accusations. It was not uncommon for women to be accused of using their menstrual blood to summon demons or cast spells to harm others. Some believed that menstruating women could cause diseases, manipulate the weather, or poison people with their blood. These beliefs were steeped in fear and ignorance, and they created an environment where accusations of witchcraft were often as arbitrary as they were deadly. Women who were unfortunate enough to be accused, or who were simply deemed different or strange by their communities, found themselves in a nightmare of persecution. In many cases, these accusations were not based on any evidence or real crime. They were rooted in fear, superstition, and an ancient desire to control and silence women. If a woman's blood was seen as dangerous, then the woman herself must be punished. The witch trials, which were rampant in medieval Europe, provided a platform for these horrific accusations. If a woman was menstruating, it was thought that she was especially susceptible to the power of witchcraft. Her very body was seen as a conduit for dark forces, and the blood she shed became proof of her connection to these powers. The trial process itself was often brutal and inhumane, with torture used to extract confessions from the accused. Women, already vulnerable and marginalized, were forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit under the unbearable weight of torture. Many were executed, burned alive, or drowned, all in the name of eliminating perceived evil. The irony of this persecution was staggering. Women were executed not for being witches, but for the natural act of menstruation. The very thing that connected them to their biological purpose, being women, became the reason for their death. In a twisted irony, menstruation, the ultimate symbol of life and fertility, was demonized and turned into a reason to accuse women of causing death. It wasn't enough that their bodies were controlled by societal laws and religious dogma. They were now condemned to death for something they could not change. Their blood, a source of life, was seen as a source of destruction. And for many women, the trial of their lives ended with them being burned at the stake or drowned in rivers, their bodies sacrificed to the ever-growing fear of witchcraft. In medieval society, where knowledge of the human body was limited, menstruation became something of an enigma, an unsolved mystery, a source of terror. And from this terror grew the witch hunts, where women were persecuted for something as natural and essential as their menstrual cycle. These women became scapegoats for everything that went wrong, blamed for societal ills that they had no control over. The witch trials, which took countless lives, were fueled by these baseless fears, and menstruation, once a biological function, became a weapon of persecution. The connection between menstruation and witchcraft was not based on any factual evidence. It was a product of a society that sought to explain the unexplainable, to control what it could not understand, and to punish those who did not conform to its rules. It was a dark chapter in history, where women were killed not for their actions, but for their very existence as women. Imagine the terror of being a woman in medieval Europe. To have your body be something that could be feared, something that could be used as evidence of witchcraft, something that marked you as inherently dangerous. Menstruation was no longer a private affair. It was a public spectacle, a reason for suspicion, for fear, for death. The fate of so many women in these dark times was sealed not by their actions, but by the blood they shed. They were innocent, yet their bodies were seen as guilty. And in this twisted version of justice, many lost their lives. The legacy of these accusations and executions still lingers in the shadows of history. It's a brutal reminder of how society can turn against women when it cannot understand, when it fears, and when it seeks to control. But these women, whose lives were tragically cut short, were not witches. They were simply women, subjected to a world that saw them as something less than human. They were persecuted for their biology, their very existence, their blood. Their stories may have been lost to time, but their suffering echoes through the centuries. So, we must ask, how much of this darkness remains in our world today? How many women still carry the weight of centuries of fear, stigma, and misunderstanding? The connection between menstruation and witchcraft may have faded from mainstream belief, but the shadows it casts still linger. And we must ask ourselves, how many women's lives were destroyed by something so natural, so fundamental as menstruation? This was the reality for countless women in medieval times, a reality of fear, persecution, and death, all because of something that should have been celebrated, not condemned. It is a dark chapter in history, one that we must remember and reflect upon. Only then can we begin to understand the true extent of the suffering these women endured and the deep-seated roots of misogyny that continue to shape our world today. Though we like to think of ourselves as having evolved, the legacy of medieval stigma still casts a long shadow over how menstruation is perceived today. For centuries, menstruation was seen as a source of shame and impurity, a perception that was deeply ingrained by the patriarchal forces of medieval society. The myths, the fears, the misconceptions, they have not simply vanished with the passage of time. In many parts of the world, menstruation is still a topic shrouded in silence. Women are still made to feel ashamed of something that is as natural as breathing, something that half the population experiences. The centuries-old narrative of menstruation as a curse, as something to be hidden and feared, continues to influence the way society views women today. In the 21st century, we still hear echoes of the medieval belief that menstruation is not just a biological process, but something unnatural, something that makes women lesser, weaker, or impure. The stigma surrounding menstruation is pervasive, festering in silence and shame. Women continue to be told that their natural bodily functions are something to be ashamed of, something to be hidden behind closed doors. And this silence is not without consequences. In some parts of the world, menstruating women are forced into seclusion, mirroring the isolation that medieval women endured in the menstrual huts. In some communities, women are still forbidden from touching food, water, or sacred objects during their periods. The very same sense of impurity that defined the medieval experience is still a part of many women's lives today, where menstruation is treated as a dirty secret, something that should be kept hidden at all costs. Even in modern societies, where access to sanitary products and education has improved, menstruation still carries a stigma. We see it in the whispers behind closed doors, in the embarrassment that many women still feel when buying pads or tampons, in the way the topic is avoided in conversation, as if acknowledging it is somehow shameful. In some professional settings, menstruation is seen as a weakness, a topic of ridicule, or something that makes women difficult or unpredictable. And though women have fought hard for equality, menstrual stigma remains a deeply rooted societal issue. We may have made strides, but the scar of centuries of suppression is still there, threading its way through the fabric of our lives. In certain parts of the world, cultural practices regarding menstruation are not just outdated, they are dangerous. In places where menstruation is still considered taboo, women are often forced into silence, much like their medieval ancestors. In rural communities across India, Nepal, and parts of Africa, menstruating women are still forced to live in isolation, restricted from entering temples, cooking, or even touching their family members. These practices, known as chapati in Nepal or menstrual huts, are remnants of a time when women's bodies were seen as dangerous and unclean, and their very presence was believed to defile the world around them. Women are still punished for something they cannot control, mirroring the isolation and punishment medieval women endured centuries ago. This is the reality that many women face today, isolated, stigmatized, and pushed into the shadows for something as simple as a natural biological process. It's a bitter irony that in the modern world, where so much has changed, the attitudes surrounding menstruation have not evolved as quickly as we would like to believe. The fear, the shame, the silence, these are the ghosts of the past that continue to haunt women today. This dark legacy, rooted in medieval misconceptions and superstition, still shapes the way we view menstruation, even in societies that claim to have moved beyond such primitive thinking. The path of progress has been slow, but it is a path that must be walked, for we cannot truly understand where we are going unless we know where we have been. The lessons of the past are not just lessons in history, they are lessons in humanity. We cannot turn a blind eye to the suffering that women endured in the name of fear and superstition. The past is not a distant, irrelevant time. It is alive, and it continues to shape the way we treat women and their bodies. So, as we reflect on the history of menstruation, let us ask ourselves, how much of this legacy still lives within us? How much of the shame, the silence, and the stigma still linger in our daily lives? How much more must we do to ensure that future generations of women will never again have to endure the isolation, the punishment, or the humiliation that was once so common? It is time for these truths to be heard. It is time for us to confront the darkness of the past and bring it into the light. If you believe that history should be remembered, that the suffering of women throughout time should not be forgotten, then hit that subscribe button right now. Do not allow these stories to fade into the background of silence. Don't be like those who ignore the lessons of the past, those who choose to remain silent about the truths that need to be heard. Your silence in the comment section says more than you think. It's time to break the silence. It's time to understand. And it's time to act.